sam shvatio da ipak još nije večer, premda je ovako mračno u Bitefu. Prije svega, jako mi je drago da se po drugi puta Filozofski teatar događa u sklopu Bitef festivala i nadam se da ćemo nastaviti ovu dobru suradnju i tradiciju. Prošle godine sa nama je bio Oliver Frljić, ove godine sa nama je Norman Olerom, kojega ću malo kasnije predstaviti. Ovo je također prvi puta da se Filozofski teatar održava upravo u Bitef teatru i mislim da je to dosta i simbolički s obzirom da se obje ove knjige koje vidite na stolu, o kojima ćemo razgovarati danas, tiču upravo od toga doba u kojem je Bitef sagrađen. But I will turn to English so that you can understand as well. Postoji prijevod, ukoliko nekome treba simultani prijevod. Slušalce možete uzeti vani. So, again, to repeat what I said in the beginning, I'm really glad that you are here with us. This theater, which used to be an unfinished evangelical Christian church built by a modernist architect from Germany, actually, from Bauhaus, is a very good example, it's a very good setting for the topics which we will explore today. Unfortunately, none of these books was published in Serbia, but this is also one of the reasons why we invited you, because I think the Philosophical Theater and also Bitef Festival wants to present new voices, but also new topics which are not mainstream yet in Serbia. Which is kind of curious because the book which originally in English is called Blitz, and in Croatian Potpuna ekstaza, although a better translation would have been Zadok spremni, which actually the translator of the book, Boris Perić, suggested, but then the publisher said it's a bit tricky, you know, in these times in Croatia to call a book Zadok spremni, they might think we were making fun of the Ustaša. But
I think they would have sold more.
Yeah, I'm sure they would have sold more. But it's a question whether in Serbia a new publication could have that title and sell more. I don't know. Maybe in Serbia no better.
Well, every country has its own approach to this topic, and it's quite interesting to see how different the approaches are.
Yeah. So, okay, instead of a big and longer introduction, Norman Olerom, I'm really glad that you are here with us. Norman is a writer, author, and how do you call it, scenarist, writing also scenarios for movies. He collaborated with inventors, for instance, published several acclaimed novels in Germany, but these last two books are actually not novels, although the topic itself sounds like not only fiction, but like science fiction, actually. Nazis on drugs, and then two other young anti-Nazi heroes. But instead of a long introduction, let us start with Blitz, or Zadok spremni, how we can call it from now on during this evening. Blitz provoked a lot of comments. It was published in the meantime, I think, in 31 languages. Serbian not yet, but we hope it will be published in Serbian as well. My first question is, why did it provoke such a big interest? As far as I know, you were the first one who really put all this material together after a detailed research for years. We can also speak about the research a bit later. But even before that, there were some hints, some details about narcotics and Nazis. So my first question is, how does it come that no one before you actually presented such a detailed overview on the relation between the rise of totalitarianism in Germany, what Hitler was doing with drugs, the role of drugs in Blitzkrieg? Why didn't anyone else connect the dots before you?
It is a very good question that I cannot answer because especially historians should have examined this topic before. But first of all, I want to thank you, Srećko, for having me here at the Philosophical Theater, and also I want to thank Bitef for having me here in Belgrade. I'm very excited to be here. It's my first time really to be here in Belgrade, and it's quite something. It reminds me a little bit of Berlin, the Berlin that I really appreciate before the Berlin of today, which is much more commodified and gentrified. So I'm quite excited to be in this urban landscape. To your question, Srećko, I think the surprising fact actually is that it is such a big topic, that the Nazis did use drugs on a massive scale, because until I started researching, I was sure that this was not the case, and every German you would have asked a few years ago would have said, no, the Nazis had, of course, nothing to do with drugs, because it was a very important aspect of Nazi ideology to present themselves as a clean movement that's all about purity, even purity of the blood. So, of course, there could be no drugs in the bloodstream. When the Nazis took power in 1933, one of the first things they did was enforce the old drug laws of the Weimar Republic, which were not enforced in the Weimar Republic. So in the Weimar Republic, until January 30, 1933, you could actually consume drugs in Berlin and in other places in Germany quite liberally. It was part of the cultural scene. Also, a lot of people, a lot of men from the First World War were still using morphine. There were a lot of morphine addicts. So drugs were an accepted or not stigmatized part of this life, and this all changed with the Nazis. They were actually putting drug users into concentration camps. In the beginning, the concentration camps in Germany, some historians call them still wild concentration camps. They were organized by the SA, and they were like torture places, basically, where leftists were communists, drug users, homosexuals. So these were the concentration camps were also used to stigmatize drug users. Anti-Semitic policies by the Nazis from early on was connected to anti-drug policy. Nazis said the Jews, they're all using drugs because they have such a low self-esteem, so they need to push themselves with drugs and morphine and cocaine. These are all degenerate Jewish drugs, and and then the Führer, Hitler, of course, he was an abstinent person. He was always depicted in the cult around Hitler. A big important part of this cult was to show him as someone who is, of course, not using drugs. He's not even drinking. He's a vegetarian. He's kind of a saint, a health freak in a way. Also, the greeting Heil Hitler refers to the health. Heil also meaning healthy. So this health cult that the Nazis, that was such a big part of Nazi propaganda, was still present when I started researching this book. For example, when I talked to my grandfather about the Nazi times, like, he would always say it was all in order, and of course no drugs, and he was still also an anti-alcoholic like the Führer. When I was approached, this was in 2010, by a friend of mine who was a DJ in Berlin, in the Club of Visionaries, that's the name of the club, and this DJ Alex, he one day or one night, or I don't know, remember exactly the time, but for him time doesn't matter because he's always on drugs, always playing music. He told me, your next book has to be about Nazis and drugs, and I said, you're crazy, that's not a topic. I mean, it sounds interesting, but Nazis didn't take drugs. But then he convinced me that they actually did, because a friend of his, who was an antique dealer, had found in an old East Berlin apartment still a package from the Nazi times, from the 40s. The package was labeled, the label on the package was Pervitin. Pervitin was a legal product back then, and the only ingredient of Pervitin is methamphetamine, and this was written on the package that they found in 2010 in an old East Berlin apartment. And these friends, the DJ and the antique dealer, they took these pills, which is kind of brave, because these pills were 60, 70 years old, and they had a very strong stimulating effect from these pills that were so old. And he told me this story, and then I got interested, and I started researching online first a little bit, Pervitin, methamphetamine, and there were some stories, and some people had, some medical, especially one medical historian had started to research this, and I approached him and I said, what's really, is this really something that is of relevance? And he said, yeah, I've researched this for a long time. You must understand, the Blitzkrieg was only possible because of methamphetamine, because the German army was the first army in the world to use methamphetamine on a large scale. And when I heard this story from an expert, then I really started my research, which led me through a lot of archives and took about 5 years, and then this book came about slowly.
To come back to Pervitin immediately, at that time Pervitin was advertised even for housewives. You know, you take some Pervitin, you will be quicker, you can clean better, and so on. And there's also in the book what you describe also very famous people who were taking Pervitin at that time, like Heinrich Böll, for instance, who writes home to his parents, "Could you please send me some more?" and so on. So could you first describe what exactly is Pervitin? I mean, we don't have to go into all the chemical details and so on. And then second, also what I find very interesting with your exploration, especially of the archives, is the role of big pharmaceutical companies at that time, like Bayer, for instance. So if you can, on the one hand, talk about Pervitin a bit more, and also what was the connection between the pharmaceutical companies and the Nazi regime and the Third Reich? What was really the connection?
Well, maybe I'll start with that. It's interesting to. I worked on this book together with the German historian Hans Mommsen, and when I told him I want to start the book with January 30th, 1933, when the Nazis take power, he said, "No, you have to start earlier. You have to actually look at how drug production starts in Germany." It's quite interesting. It starts in the 19th century. In Germany, a young chemist in 1805 isolated morphine from the poppy plant. So before that, when people had severe pain, they would somehow make a brew out of poppy flowers, and opium basically is the strongest painkiller. And in 1805, this chemist was able to isolate the alkaloid that is responsible for killing the pain, and that is morphine. And from that moment on, pharmacies in Germany, and also outside of Germany, but mostly in Germany it started, developed from kind of when you went into the pharmacy in 1790 and you said you had this and this problem, then sometimes they would go into the herb garden, maybe give you herbs, but this all changed when morphine was discovered. Then the pharmacies started to develop products that would have the same qualities. So they would roll pills, they could measure exactly the alkaloid morphine, so they started standardizing their medicines, and out of these pharmacies these pharmacies slowly turned into pharmaceutical companies. Like there was a pharmacy in Darmstadt, a German town, which was the Merck pharmacy. It was owned by a guy called Merck, and this slowly turned into the Merck pharmaceutical company, which is now a global player. So in Germany, in a way, drug producing started, and Germany also was a country that was divided into many provinces. It didn't have colonies like other European countries that could import stimulants from their colonies. Germany was not able to do that, so there was a big need to self-produce drugs and stimulants. So the pharmaceutical industry in Germany in the 19th century was very important for the German economy and also for the German cultural life and general life. And companies like Bayer became bigger and bigger. Bayer, for example, developed in the late 19th century one chemist called Hoffmann. Within the span of 10 days, he found two new medicines. One is aspirin and one is heroin. And for his CEO, both medicines were amazing. I quote some of what they quoted about heroin in the beginning. They were really happy about heroin. It was recommended by Bayer. You can find online old advertisements of heroin. It was recommended even as a cough syrup for babies. No, cough syrup for adults and sleeping aid for babies. If you have a baby, you might understand why it sounds quite plausible. Baby doesn't want to sleep, you give him a little bit of heroin, will sleep very well. So there was a lot of drug production happening in Germany, and people had a completely different view on drugs. Today we think of drugs as dangerous and we get addicted. Back then it was effective medicine. So
the real peak was, we can see it in the TV series Babylon Berlin, right? The real peak of these drugs was in the Weimar Republic. Would you agree with that?
Probably yes, because it was probably it was, but also we have to be careful with the Weimar Republic. Sometimes it's overstated how many drugs they were taking all the time, but it is a fact that drug taking was a normal, it was not stigmatized as I said before. So interestingly enough, obviously the Nazis stopped that liberal approach to drugs, And then even more interesting is the year 1936, the Olympic Games in Berlin, and there is an Afro-American, Jesse Owens, who runs faster than the Aryan superhuman whites, which doesn't match with the ideology of the Nazis. So there were rumors that actually the Americans are using something to enhance the performance, which they might have, but I researched this. There's no proof that Jesse Owens was actually using a doping agent, but in fact, this got one person's mind started. His name is Temmler. He had a pharmaceutical company in Berlin called the Temmler Company, and he said to his chief chemist, Dr. Fritz Hauschild, probably the Americans are taking something called benzedrine, or it's an amphetamine. It just improves your performance. You can run faster. That's the only reason why Jesse Owens would run faster than us Germans. So you have to find a better amphetamine. And then Fritz Hauschild researched and worked for 1 year, and then he found methamphetamine. And methamphetamine is stronger than amphetamine. If you take methamphetamine, you're immediately awake. Like I was really tired before this talk started because we had a Serbian lunch, and you can imagine what that means. I didn't take methamphetamine. I thought I would need methamphetamine, but actually just being here on stage kind of wakes me up. But if I would be tired, it would have been perfect at 3 p.m. to take 1 pill of pervitin. I would be even more alive and talkative as I am already. So this was, when it came out onto the market in 1938, it was a big sensation in Germany, because with pervitin, which you could buy in any pharmacy, you would just be like a little bit more awake, a little bit smarter while the effect is going. So this was perfect for the modern performance society, which was the Nazi dictatorship. Everyone had to be working, everyone had to be part of the movement that was that was gripping the people. Germany was waking up. That was actually a slogan by the Nazis, Deutschland erwache, Germany wake up. And methamphetamine was called a waking agent. If you take methamphetamine, you're not tired, that's for sure. So it was really the drug of the moment, but it would also be the drug of the moment now probably, because it's just a drug for a modern society where you just have to be part of the rat race and perform and be good all the time. You don't need to drink 3 cups of coffee anymore, 1 pill of pervitin, that's enough. So in 1938 it became a big hit for the Temmler Company. They expanded, the company got, the production facilities got much bigger. Like in the book there's a funny ad printed that shows a chocolate that even came on the market. It was advertised especially for German housewives, which Hitler wanted to stay in the home and just clean the home. It's very boring. But this chocolate contained 9 milligrams each piece, 9 milligrams of pure methamphetamine. So, you know, even if you stay at home and just clean, you're not bored at all. You're in a very good mood. And so this is across the board. Pervitin became a big hit, and then of course something happened. Germany was preparing for war.
Yes, and then we come to a very interesting part of the book, which is that at one moment they sent 35 million pills of something for the Blitzkrieg, and that, until you discovered this, I mean, it was known, but no one actually, I think, among the historians, posed the questions, what were the pills? So you posed that question and you found that the pills were what? And in what way did it actually influence the Blitzkrieg, and what kind of substances did the French take? Could you speak about that a bit?
Well, there was one professor working for the German army, his name is Ranke, and he was responsible for performance enhancement of the German army. And his main concern was fatigue. He wanted to find something that keeps the soldier awake for a longer period of time, because he reasoned that if you could have another maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 hours of battle time, and your enemy doesn't have that, you would have a clear advantage. So when pervitin became so popular, he of course realized that, and he made tests among young medical officers, and he concluded, yes, with pervitin we can keep the German army awake for a longer period of time, and we can therefore overrun the enemy. So this was included into the it wasn't called Blitzkrieg then, it was only called Blitzkrieg after it happened, but it was included into the aggressive strategy of attacking Poland for the first time. No, it was not officially part of the attack on Poland, but in Poland the Professor Ranke did a survey and realized that many medical officers wrote back to him that pervitin has already been used on a massive scale. Then Ranke went to his superiors and said, for a possible attack against the West, we have to implement pervitin on an official level. This was done on April 17, 1940. There was the so-called Stimulant Decree issued by the German army. Stimulant Decree was a two-page paper that was given to all medical officers, and it explained what pervitin is. Most of them already knew what it was, but it just wrote it down. Pervitin is a waking agent. It includes methamphetamine. If you take one pill, you keep a soldier awake for 12 hours. After these 12, like in the 10th hour, you give him the next pill, he will stay awake for another 8 hours. So it was detailed. And then the German army ordered 35 million tablets from the Temmler Company for the attack on France, which started on May 10th, 1940. So this attack saw a massive intake of methamphetamine, and it saw a German army that kept going for 3 days and nights without stopping. And this was also a crucial part of that military campaign, because the campaign, the main idea of the campaign was to avoid the same strategy as in First World War, where the Germans attacked in the north of Belgium, and this was where the British and French defense forces were. In 1940, they thought Germany would again attack in the north of Belgium, and then in the more south there was the Maginot Line, the French defense line, but there was a strip of mountainous terrain in between the Ardennes Mountains, and the German strategy was to race through the Ardennes Mountains in 3 days and 3 nights and reach Sedan, the French border city, cutting off the Western allies. This is a so-called, what Churchill then called the sickle cut, because this is exactly what happened, and this was only possible because human beings, German soldiers in this case, were able to keep marching for 3 days and 3 nights, which is, if you don't take methamphetamine, absolutely impossible. You will have to sleep after. We will all be tired tonight. Maybe we can make it through another night, but that's already difficult. But they made it for 3 days and 3 nights, and this is only possible with methamphetamine. So the chemical weapon that the Germans used is not the only explanation why the Blitzkrieg worked, but it's an essential tool for the overall strategy and campaign. And this had not been actually examined, but this is very detailed in documents that are stored in the military archive in Freiburg, which I studied. There was this one medical historian who had started to research this, so I could start from his vantage point and really make an overall picture. And lastly, to your question, what did the French use? Because it actually is a fact that soldiers, as long as there are soldiers on the planet, as long as we are fighting wars, men are fighting wars, they always use whatever they can in order to improve their combat capabilities. It's a very normal, natural thing. You go into a battle, you're afraid to die. If your friend says you should smoke a cigarette, then you will be calmer and you will fight better. Of course, you're going to smoke the cigarette. Or the British Navy used rum to increase the mood of the troops in the Middle Ages and later on. In the First World War, cocaine was used by a small fraction of fighter pilots of the Air Force of Germany. So obviously the French were also thinking, what should we take? And they had taken actually red wine in the First World War, quite successfully in the First World War, because the First World War was a trench war. So they were in trenches for years without moving a lot. So you need to drink wine in the evening, otherwise you really have a bad mood. So the idea in France was, through the red wine, the blood of the country, we succeeded in the First World War, so they did it again in the Second World War. The day Germany attacked on May 10th, 1940, 3,400 trucks filled with red wine left the French wine regions and drove up to the north of Belgium to supply the French with red wine there. The ruling was every French soldier can drink 3/4 of a liter of red wine per day, which certainly makes you a little bit tired. And just imagine those slightly tired French soldiers being approached by totally methed up German freaks. It's an asymmetrical warfare which led to the very quick defeat of France in this campaign. It's not funny, but it is funny. No, it's not funny, but it sounds funny.
Yeah, and obviously it carries a lot of lessons for our moment today, when, well, on the one hand we can see that also pilots, American pilots bombing Iraq, Afghanistan and so on, are also using methamphetamine, for instance, or when the leading politicians are actually known to be using all other sorts of drugs.
Except Merkel.
Yeah,
she's not
who
using
knows?
it.
But that means she's even more crazy. Who knows? But we'll come back to the contemporary time. Just one last question before we do that, about another important character of the book, but also a very important character not only of a book but of the Nazi reality, was Theodor Morell, whom we didn't mention yet, and he was Hitler's private doctor. Could you a bit talk about the significance of Morell, and what kind of drugs did Hitler use, and what did you discover about the last days of Hitler in his bunker? What kind of combinations did he take, and how much did it influence on his public speeches, persona, and so on?
Well, it's like the second pillar of the book is actually a biography of Hitler, and I started thinking of Hitler and of Dr. Morell when I was in the Federal Archives in Koblenz in Germany, when I read the notes of Theo Morell. Theo Morell was a celebrity doctor in Berlin in the 30s, and he then became the personal physician of Hitler. And Theo Morell in the beginning was a vitamin specialist. He was one of the few people, doctors in the world, that understood that it's very important to give people vitamins. This was not so known at the time. So he was an avant-garde doctor. And Hitler, who still was a health freak actually at the time, when he met Morell, and Morell told him, you have to have vitamins every day, and you don't take them orally, I will inject high dosages of vitamins into your bloodstream every day and you will never be sick again. Hitler thought this is fantastic. He found the right doctor, and from 1936 on, Theo Morell was the personal physician of Hitler all the way to April 1945. They spent every day together, and actually Morell injected Hitler every day. So Hitler received 1 to 2 intravenous injections each day from 1936 to 1945, which is a crazy amount. Thousands of injections, and it's even more interesting if you look at what was in the injections, because the mixture of these shots changes. It changes in August 1941, when Hitler, despite of all the vitamins, for the first time does get ill. He has so-called Russian fever, as we say in German, die Ruhr. This is in a crucial moment of the war of Germany against the Soviet Union, when the generals want to head straight to Moscow, while Hitler has the idea to split up the troops and go to Leningrad and to the south to get the oil. So, and there was a dispute. Hitler had a lot of disputes actually with high command, and this was a crucial dispute. And during this dispute, Hitler was ill. He had very high fever, and he couldn't go to the military briefing. So he said to Morell, I need something stronger than vitamins. This is all noted by Morell. Morell describes exactly how Hitler looks and what Hitler says to him. And then Morell decides to give him Dolantin, which is another beautiful German product. It's a very potent opioid. So he injects him with this opioid, and Hitler immediately, the opioid erases any flu immediately if you get it in a high enough dosage. It's such a strong medication. So Hitler gets up and goes to the briefing and can still be the dictator he wants to be, can make the decisions that he needs to make. And from that moment on, the mixture in Hitler's daily injections gets more and more enriched with opioids, with hormones, with steroids, and you can kind of write or tell the narrative of, in a way, a drug career. And this comes to extremes in 1944 after the assassination attempt of Stauffenberg on July 20th. After that decisive event, Hitler really becomes a crazy drug taker. He takes opioids every other day intravenously in such high dosages that any junkie can only dream of such a high quality product being brought to him by his personal physician, administered. And while he's taking these opioids, and sometimes they come down a little bit, he takes cocaine, so he's, in a way he's on speed, he's on a speedball. I mean, it's really insane what he takes in the second half of 1944. So it's very interesting to describe the abstinent Führer, to describe the reality and deconstruct some of those last Hitler myths that were still around in Germany not too long ago, by people who at least, you know, they thought Hitler was of course a bad person, but at least he was like a clear leader. And I even meet people in other parts of the world where the book comes out who cannot believe that this cannot be their Hitler. Like in India, people were shocked because in India Hitler is still revered as this great leader, and for the Indian public, for example, to read about Hitler as a total junkie was a shock.
Yeah, even this Croatian edition of the book actually shows a very young, healthy, fresh Hitler. Maybe he just took a dose before the photo, who knows. But what I find interesting too, you mentioned the opioids, and in Zagreb when we had a debate 1 year ago, we actually spoke about the still ongoing opioid crisis in the US. So moving from history to contemporary era and then jumping to your most recent book just published a few days ago, let me pose you a question. You know, what would you say, what lessons does this examination between the relation between narcotics and Nazism and totalitarianism, what lessons does it carry for our today's era? Would you, for instance, agree with a Belgian philosopher called Laurent de Soutier, who wrote a really nice little book called Narco-Capitalism, where he basically claims that it is capitalism itself which is narcotic. And then you have another writer on narcotics, the famous Italian journalist, maybe more famous for Gomorrah series, Roberto Saviano, who wrote an incredible book, I would say, also with a lot of research in Colombia, Mexico, and so on, called 000, which is the purest form of cocaine, where he basically has a thesis that it is a cash injection of cocaine narco market, which actually helped capitalism to survive the 2007-2008 financial crash. And it's interesting, even now today, when you see, you know, this kind of very bizarre happenings. We mentioned it yesterday, the other day ago, when a Serbian narco cartel was found, and you could have seen big packages of cocaine with the image of Gavrilo Princip on it, which is really kind of enigmatic. Why would you put it there? Do the narco cartels think that they are actually defying global imperialism as Gavrilo Princip did or not? But anyhow, the question is, do you agree that also that we all shouldn't just speak about the correlation between narcotics and Nazism, but also the correlation between narcotics and capitalism? Also to the degree that all these companies were operating during Nazism and they are still there. What were, a sub-question, sorry for so many questions, what were the reactions of Bayer, for instance, and the pharmaceutical companies to this book?
Well, this is the easiest question all the way at the end, but for example, I spoke to Temmler, to the Temmler company about this because I wanted to have all documents, and the press person at Temmler was very forthcoming. He thought it was very interesting, and he was interested in revealing the history of his company, so he gave me all this information. Also, all photos are published in the book, and then the next day he said that he was called back from his superiors, he's no longer allowed to talk to me, which I thought was completely ridiculous, that the company would try to hide their past and what they made their fortune on. But then again, it's probably not. Only if you think that capitalism is an honest system, you probably think it's strange that they hide it. I mean, I totally agree with the thesis that there is a lot to examine between the black market, the black drug market, and our capitalist system. I mean, the war against drugs that the United States is fighting for decades now is a very dirty war to cover up mechanisms of control of the own population, to punish minorities within their own population, but also to keep other emerging countries in Latin America down, and to create a situation where the ruling elite, the capitalist ruling elite, that is causing so many problems to our democracy, that democratic system that we were once also proud of. So I think that actually there's a continuation between how the Nazis used drugs in order to manipulate not only soldiers but also the whole population, and the way that the leading countries today, like the United States but also the European countries, are using the anti-drug laws to manipulate global policies in a way that the system keeps stable. And this is of course on the back of us, of people, of people who are in prison, of people who are impoverished in so-called third world countries, but also in so-called first world countries. So for me it was always obvious that the democratic project needs to end the war on drugs and needs to find a way to deal with the whole subject of pharmaceutical industry and illegal drugs. I mean, the pharmaceutical industry is probably the second biggest industry after the arms trade. Of course, they're obviously very interested in having certain drugs illegal. We need only speak of marijuana, which obviously has medical benefits that a lot of people cannot enjoy because it's simply not legal. So they rely on chemical medicines that have much worse side effects, but are much more expensive and create much more profit for companies. But this is really an endless topic that's, of course, one of the most controversial and interesting topics we could talk about.
We could.
And we are. I mean, we are. But it's you know.
And we also have a Q&A later, but I suggest that with the audience, so you can pose more questions on this topic. I also find very interesting the relation between, let's say, the effects which drugs produce and the effects, the correlation with drugs and technology, for instance, where you can also see that this new technological capitalism actually is also a sort of narco-capitalism without using methamphetamines, cocaine and so on. It is actually provoking the same kind of chemical reactions in the brain, like in the sense there are scientific studies already showing that when you use your smartphone, that by every like you get on your Instagram or your post is shared by thousands of people or hundreds or whatever, you actually have a kick of serotonin, dopamine, noradrenaline and so on. So that might also be an interesting topic to explore, but in order not to monopolize the stage and the microphone, I would switch to the other book, which I think both the books should be read together, and I'm really glad that today we are also opening a conversation about this book. It's a kind of Uraufhebung, or how you would say in Germany. Uraufführung, yeah, sorry for my bad German. Like a sort of world premiere of the book, which still didn't have a German premiere. And to be honest, I also didn't read the whole book yet because it's quite big, and Norman was sending the book to a Croatian island, but it never arrived. So in the last 2 days I was like a character of the first book, maniacally reading very quickly the second book. The correlation, there are many correlations between the books, and I would say if this book, Blitz, about the Nazis and drugs, shows a very dystopian, anti-utopian world, I would say the other book actually shows that at that time in Nazi Germany there was a resistance movement. Here in Serbia, I guess also in other parts of Europe, people mainly know about, whom you already mentioned, Graf von Stauffenberg, the one who attempted the assassination of Hitler, or the Sophie Scholl and so on, Weiße Rose, as the only resistance movements in Germany. And there is also very often a question, why didn't the Germans react? They knew that people were being led to concentration camps and so on. But what you show is actually that there was a big group of people who really reacted. What I really like is the introduction to the book, where you are very personal, and you mentioned your grandfather who worked for the German railway, and I will not spoil it, but you mentioned his reaction to what was happening in Germany. I would mention another one, and then I will pose you a question or just ask you to give us the story in a nutshell. I find it interesting that this book and this big political adventure of Haro and Libertas, the main characters, so this is not a fictional book, this is a historical account, but which is read as fiction, that they were operating actually in the same years when this place here, this church, was built. And I find it interesting that the architect of this church, or theater today, Otto Bartning, was one who knew what was happening, unlike many other Germans, and decided to resign as a professor of architecture in Germany and retreated to church architecture. While at the same time 14 other Bauhaus members, he was part of the Bauhaus group, continued to work, and some of them even worked under Albert Speer. So I think in a way this church could be interpreted as a sort of resistance, you know, that an architect doesn't have to build as Albert Speer did, whom you mentioned also in this book, as he used actually theater and architecture to reinforce Hitler. So that's what I find interesting among many other parts of the book. But let's just start from the story and from the beginning. Who are Haro and Libertas? Were they known in Germany before that also? Or do you think that also, as with the first book, not first but the Blitzed one, you could provoke a new interest or shed a new light on this resistance movement?
Well, Haro and Libertas are not that known yet in Germany. There was one standard book about the German resistance which just came out a few weeks ago, an academic book by a historian, and he says that their group is actually the most important and more important than the White Rose. So this was the first time that this was acknowledged in the German canon. For me, these two characters have been very interesting for quite a few years now, because they are, in a way, maybe similar to myself or similar to many people in my circle of friends. Or they could be like us if we would be in Nazi Berlin now, or if such a totalitarian regime would suddenly emerge around us now. How would we behave? Would we just continue with our career and say yes, or would we risk our lives to try to do something against it? I think those were the questions that interested me. So Haro and Libertas actually formed, they were together, they were a couple, they met in 1934. Haro was already working or thinking of going into the resistance in 1933. So they over the years until 1942, when they were found out, I will not spoil more, but this I can say because the book ends in 1942 on Christmas. They tried to develop techniques of resistance for these nine years. So they were experimenting with different forms of doing something against the dictatorship. One of the things they created a network of friends around them. The idea of Haro was, we do not construct a closed group like the communist resistance did, because those groups that were organized on certain clandestine principles, they were all smashed by the Gestapo. The Gestapo was always able to infiltrate these more conventional resistance groups. And so Haro said, we will create a resistance group based on personal friendship. We will not give each other a name, and we will not have an ideology. So we will be, in a way, a network, a network of friends that will exchange in a truthful manner the information that we have, and we will try to find more and more friends, and then at one point our web will be so vast throughout Berlin that the regime cannot function anymore and that the regime will collapse. This was, in a way, the idea of how kind of to fight the dictatorship, which was built on lies and propaganda, through an honest exchange of truth. And this included, for example, also that these people among themselves would also not live the moral ideologies that the Nazis, who were kind of, in German we say Spießer, which I don't know what the English translation is, it was a very rigid idea of how a woman and a man should be together. The man makes the career and the woman is at home. And for Haro and Libertas this was totally different. They also allowed among themselves to have affairs, even though they were married. They said it's okay if you want to have sex with another friend. Like, they weren't mad at each other, so they were really in a way experimenting with ideas that only later in the 60s again became popular. So they already did this during the Nazi dictatorship, but it wasn't compulsory that you practiced free love if you were in that group. But you could if you wanted to. But like, there were others in the group who were against it, so they were very tolerant in each kind of direction. In some of their resistance activities, for example, included a sort of, not graffiti action, but it was similar to a graffiti party that they did on, this was in May 17th, 1942. They printed 1,000 leaflets which said Nazi paradise. This was in relation to a propaganda exhibit that the Nazis had at the time, which was called the Soviet Paradise in Berlin, in the center of Berlin. The Nazis rebuilt a Soviet city, showing how dirty and how degenerate it is, and they called this the Soviet Paradise, and this was visited by millions of Germans. It was the most successful propaganda show by the Nazis. So Haro and Libertas created this leaflet. It was called Nazi Paradise. It said, Nazi Paradise, lies, Gestapo, hunger, war, how long will it last? And on that night of May 17th, always two of the group went together as a couple, and they were posing at midnight on strategic places all over Berlin, and they were hugging and kissing, so no one would look, because if the couple is kissing, everyone looks away in Nazi Germany. And then they were gluing this leaflet onto the wall. So on the morning of May 18, 1942, there were over 1,000 of these leaflets pasted all over Germany. And the Germans, the Berliners who saw these, at least had like a moment of reflection of, oh, there are actually people who protest, to do something against it. Maybe I should do something, or maybe not. Who knows what they were thinking, but at least this was like one of the things that they did. Very brave thing, and they did other things, and I just they're a very interesting group. That's why I wrote a book about them. Yeah, because you always have to find a topic that you find interesting even after 2 years.
Yeah, but it's also true that you started to work on the book while you were working on the previous book, right? You basically found a letter, if I'm correct, of Haro in the archives, right?
Yeah, I found a letter in the Institute for Contemporary History in Munich. The last letter that Haro wrote to his father, and the letter was written so well, in such a brilliant literary style, that I wondered who's this guy and what he was in the resistance. I had never heard about him, which is another very interesting topic. Why don't we know about Haro and Libertas? Why do we know about the White Rose? Well, when the system found out about this group, Hitler personally was so infuriated that he ordered that all memories of this group have to be destroyed. So all the, not all, but a lot of documents were destroyed. And even the parents were called by the Gestapo and were told that they are not allowed anymore to speak about their kids. If they would mention their kids one more time, they would end up in concentration camps. So the system tried to destroy their story as an additional punishment for their illegal clandestine activities.
What I find particularly interesting in the book, it's also, already you mentioned it, like that as if in a way Haro and Libertas and their resistance group anticipated what would come, you know, in '68 with Kommune 1 in Germany, with the Studentenbewegung, perhaps even with the Rote Armee Fraktion, who also started in the beginning as a kind of subversive group which was making this kind of half theater, half performance actions. Also leaflets about the Frankfurt, that was the big case when father ended up in prison for the first time, the leaflets about the big shopping mall in Frankfurt, and that all shopping malls should burn and so on. So I think I see these correlations, but one particularly interesting correlation is what you mentioned in the book, actually, that Haro had a kind of vision, what Rudi Dutschke would later in the 60s call the Lange Marsch durch die Institutionen, the long march through the institutions. So at the beginning they were publishing this subversive publication, Gegner, until he was arrested. And then later on also Libertas leaves the job at this big company MGM, the film studio where she even listened to Hitler's Frieden, famous Friedensrede. And Haro starts thinking, and she helps him in another direction to get a job at the German Luftwaffe, where his boss was actually Göring. What is remarkable here is actually, I think that it anticipates, it's funny that this book is coming out at the same time when Edward Snowden's memoirs are coming out and provoking a big public debate, luckily again, and even the United States suing Snowden, which is, you know, in the same way ridiculous but also worrying as the case of Chelsea Manning, who has to pay now $1,000 a day as a punishment for not testifying against Julian Assange. So I just mentioned three persons now. Julian Assange, who is at a Supermax prison in Belmarsh in UK, and they want him extradited to the United States, where he will spend more than 170 years in prison for revealing dirty war secrets of the United States engagement in Afghanistan, but also other countries. I mentioned Chelsea Manning, who is at this moment also in prison, and Snowden, who is luckily in Russia, but who is being sued by United States. And then we come back to this book and to Haro, who worked for the Luftwaffe and then did something remarkable, similar to what these people did. He revealed the document, sensitive material, basically about the start of the Second World War, to the Soviets and to the Western Allies. So my question is, would you describe Haro as, let's say, one of the first whistleblowers in the 20th century, and what did he exactly do, and what was his punishment?
Well, I think he was having to answer some of the same questions that, for example, Snowden had to answer. Because working for the Luftwaffe, he realized that Germany was preparing for war, and then he was in this conflict, what to do with this information. Shall I leak this information? Because he knew at one point, while the war was already going on, he knew the exact date when Germany would attack the Soviet Union, and he knew this about half a year earlier. So, and obviously also he knew that if the Soviet Union knows that Germany would break the Hitler-Stalin Pact and attack in July, first it was May, then it shifted a couple of times, but he always knew about also these shifts. He knew that the Soviet Union could, of course, prepare themselves for an attack, and this might help the Soviet Union defend itself against fascism, and for Haro it was clear that England alone would not be able to destroy fascism. Only the Red Army was was a strong enough force to withstand an assault of the Wehrmacht, of the German army. So he had to decide whether he would actually commit treason against his own country in order to, in a way, help his country, because his main goal was to free Germany from fascism, from National Socialism. So I think this might have been similar to what Snowden had to decide, and so I think you're right. You could call Haro an early whistleblower, and he did blow the whistle. He did inform the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union immediately reacted with trying to hire him as a spy. They said, "Okay, this is great. We will make a deal with you, and you will work for us and give us all the information that you have." And Haro clearly said, "No, he will not do this. He's not a spy, but he will continue to share all the information he has with the Soviet Union, and then also he shared information with the Western Allies, with the British." So he made that decision, and that decision actually was what infuriated Hitler so heavily, because for Hitler, of course, it was treason. The German army, it was that what Hitler always feared the most is that his own people stabbed the German army in the back. This is what a legend about the First World War, that there were parts of the army that was kind of going against themselves. So in a way, they saw Harro and his friends to do the same thing. So when they were found out, they were put on trial in Germany, not for being a resistance movement, but for being a spy organization, which they were not, but this was the spin that the Gestapo put on the group, and they were tried for high treason and punished for high treason. And this was actually the reason why in West Germany in the 50s, when surviving members of the network were trying to try not the judge, but what's the English term for the prosecutor, the Nazi prosecutor, and the Nazi prosecutor was able to convince West German intelligence and American intelligence that this spy group is still active actually and is still spying for the Soviet Union. And so even in West Germany after the war, the resistance work of Harro and Libertas was not accepted as a resistance work, just like the Weiße Rose. The Weiße Rose were always held very high in West Germany, which is, they should be held up very high because they did proper resistance work, but so did Harro and Libertas. But they were labeled even all the way up until the 80s, when Chancellor Kohl answered a letter of Harro's brother Hartmut, who was still alive back then and who had been an ambassador of West Germany later on, answered a letter of Hartmut where Hartmut said to Kohl, "Can my brother now be finally rehabilitated and accepted and seen in the German public as a resistance fighter?" Kohl answered, "No, he was not. He was working against the good of Germany, and he has this treason suspicion still hanging around him." So this actually is also part of why this story is not yet that known, and slowly, obviously the reception of this group changes. In the 90s, there was a historian who helped me work on this book, who went to Moscow, and he was able to go into the archives in Moscow and actually find the documents that prove that Harro and his friends said no to the Soviets when they said, "Please be our spies." So now it has become, it's becoming clearer and clearer what the role of this group actually was and should be seen as.
Before opening the floor for your questions, just one comment and then my last question. I really see a lot of parallels, as you said, if you look what's happening and what happened to Edward Snowden after releasing these huge amounts of documents about what the National Security Agency was doing and how they were actually spying the citizens. He was immediately accused as a Russian spy, of course. And there is also this funny video with funny or scary, depends on your perspective, of Vladimir Putin complaining that Edward Snowden never revealed them any documents, but that actually he should do it. And I don't know what he's doing with that computer instead of giving us the documents. You can find it on YouTube. And what is even more worrying is that also at this moment, and all the last 10 years, also WikiLeaks was constantly being accused of being a spy organization, although what they were doing is actually publishing all the information about crimes of foreign governments and so on. So unfortunately it seems we are coming back to these dark times of the 20th century. But there is one scene which is kind of, in a dark way, hopeful, I would say, and it's the only scene which takes place in ex-Yugoslavia, namely on an island which would later become more known as the island of the famous Praxis school, where also a lot of Germans basically came, Herbert Marcuse, Ernst Bloch, during the 60s and 70s, which is also a topic which, as this maybe in Germany, the topic of Praxis school is definitely a completely underrated topic in contemporary Serbia or Croatia, unfortunately. And there is a scene when they come and they try to hide from Germany and come with their Fiat car to Venice and then later to Dubrovnik and then Korčula. And I don't know whether it's your imagination, but I can imagine them as also like that, posing these questions. They're staying at a hotel in Korčula and posing the questions, should we just stay here? You know, it's such a beautiful island. And I can assume many of you have this same feeling when you go to any island during the summer and, you know, should you return back to your life or should I just stay living like that? And then there is this crucial moment, which I find quite shocking, is they turn around and behind the reception of this Korčula hotel, they see a portrait of Göring hanging. Who visited Korčula in 1935, which I didn't know before reading the book. And then they returned back to Germany, aware that what Hitler said in his Friedensrede, which Libertas was actually listening, it is the famous peace speech by Hitler where he says, there are no islands anymore. And then you see that she listened to the speech, she came to Korčula, she realized there are really no islands anymore if there is a portrait of Göring in Korčula. And what they do then is they come back to Germany, and it's 9th of November, which is, you know, a historical date in Germany, not just because of the beginning of the 20th century, but also what happened during the Nazi time. So my question is, if you have this in mind, basically it seems to me as if it is not possible to escape resistance for some people. But how is it possible for some people to escape resistance and to participate in the system? And what is the lesson of this book and this experience of Haro and Libertas for our days today and for a possible resistance movement which we obviously need, not only in Serbia but also in Germany and Brazil and so on?
Well, I'm still thinking about this every day, and I start to make up my mind, find out, am I doing any resistance or am I doing nothing, and when should I start doing something? And I think it's really a difficult question, and I also want to thank you for your book Poetry from the Future. It gives me actually some, or at least it wakes me up that maybe we're all Haro before actually having to do something. And I just think maybe for us it's even more difficult, because for Haro and Libertas the enemy was very clear, and now we are even becoming, we ourselves are becoming the enemy by using the surveillance products that more and more make our democracy hollower and hollower. So I think we have to be really on our toes right now, but because I was writing so much about the past, I haven't had enough time yet to think of how I should manage my presence. Maybe you have some answers. What should we do? What is resistance today?
Well, we could have another hour of this, but then we could turn into Fidel Castro. Maybe what I actually, what gave me hope by reading your book was the moment, the fact that Haro and Libertas, when they were with other friends publishing this subversive magazine called Gegner, which means, I would say, translated as enemy, they were also, you know, you can very often think that it happens sometimes, it happens to me all the time, so, you know, you look at these two guys at the stage, you are just talking around, you're at this beautiful theater, which is part of a beautiful festival, and then you will leave, and you will have a drink, and you will go home, and some people will make a selfie with you, and some other lucky people who have a book will get a signature and so on, and everyone will go home, our conscience will be clear, and so on. And in the evening you smoke a joint or you take some methamphetamine and go partying. I mean, it's obviously people are laughing because you have this kind of experience. And then you can pose the question, you know, what the fuck does it mean to have this kind of event? It's just another event, people are having fun, we are Muppet Show, you're laughing and so on. But what they showed is that they were also organizing public events, you know, that's what I like, that's one of the lessons, you know. On the one hand they were publishing a magazine which was read by 5,000 people, which is much more than many other subversive magazines are being read, unfortunately, in ex-Yugoslavia. Most of them are demolished, or like Zares, Le Monde Diplomatique in Croatia and so on, they don't exist anymore. We have luckily Novosti in Croatia, which is still kind of subversive. But you can see that they were covering many fields. And I think that might be a possible way out for the future. So they were publishing independent journals, they were organizing public events where they would gather people who think alike, or even people who don't think alike but might join them. And then in the end, they went for the most radical of the solutions, which is basically what you said, yeah, how can we get out if we are already the enemies ourselves by using this kind of stuff? You know, computer surveillance systems and being the spies of ourselves to almost like that. I think what Haro showed is that, yes, you can use the means of the system against the system. You know, he was really, as far as I got by reading half of the book, and I can't wait to read the rest of it, so let's finish soon. Joking, we'll have questions, but what I really liked is that he was, you know, doing something, even working for the enemy in order to reveal the secrets of the enemy. Precisely what Snowden was doing. And also, your point is that it wasn't really a movement, it was more like a social network, before a social network. And I think this is a big lesson, because the topic of today's, this year's Bitef Festival is Zajednica, which means community. And I think this is a way to build a new community. You know, I'm not a utopian who thinks that, you know, just by connecting to other people you might make a revolutionary resistance movement, but I think it's necessary for people to connect, even if they are not on the same level of political spectrum, you know, because I think this is also, we've seen it in, well, during the Weimar Republic and the role of the Social Democrats, and before with Rosa Luxemburg and so on. What happens when people are not connecting, when they are actually disconnecting from people who might be their allies? So in that sense, I think we really need to build a very broad internationalist movement. Haro was also an internationalist, which would try to build new alliances, which would try to use new means of subversion, being prepared for the wars to come. Yeah, and the best, which is the questions of the audience, I hope. So if you have a, first I would ask a big applause for Norman. And now, if you have a question, please raise your hand. There are two mics here. They will try to come to your place if we see you. Možete postaviti pitanje i na srpskom, i na hrvatskom, i bosanskom, i crnogorskom, i svim ostalim jezicima, prevešćemo ih na engleski. Okay, questions? There is a question there, which, so the mic is coming.
Yeah, so my question is basically just following up on what you said about this connection between how Haro thought that the truth is somehow enough or is very important in the act of resistance. But yeah, the comparison with today's situation and with the situation of Assange, for example, whose campaign around him and around WikiLeaks has always been based on this insistence on the truth. So is the lesson or is the conclusion that the truth is definitely not enough and it doesn't matter at all, maybe?
Question is for you, Norman.
It's too difficult to answer. It's very melancholic to think about it. It's also that sentence that love is, what if love is not enough? Can you help me, Srećko? It was, I think the question was for you, actually.
No, I think it was, she knows what I think about the topic, I guess. I spoke about it a lot. But if I can, I'm also a bit skeptical, you know, that, you know, this WikiLeaks is also using, and as you know, I'm a supporter of WikiLeaks. I consider Julian my dear friend, whom I didn't see from last November. You know, the slogan of WikiLeaks was "the truth will set you free," which, you know, is not a slogan from WikiLeaks, but goes back to something else, to a book, very famous. But I think, you know, in this era of post-truth, fake news, deep fakes, you know, where artificial intelligence can even make a video and you don't know whether it's Trump talking or artificial intelligence, I think in this era it's very problematic whether it's really the truth which can set us free, which can be a mean of resistance, because I think you also need something much more than just the truth, which is imagination or inspiring people by something which, you know, just look at the guys, and it's mainly the guys, with a few women as well, but it's mainly the guys who are in power today. Sebastian Kurz, well, he's not in power, is he? Who knows what's happening in Austria? It's changing all the time, but elections are coming soon. Viktor Orban, Bolsonaro, Donald Trump. Well, let's not start with the Balkans. But there is a big list of autocratic leaders who are using technology, who are using, like the Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal, which revealed that Steve Bannon was actually behind manipulating with data in order to get Trump or Brexit to power and so on. And then you can see that what they are doing and what they are using in order to get to power is precisely the opposite than the truth. And then when you reveal the truth, Panama Papers, for instance, you know, did it really reveal something which we don't know? It's important that Panama Papers happened, but I'm saying it's not enough, because we knew that capital is flying, you know, to the Bahamas or to Monaco or to Luxembourg, but in order to really prevent that, you need something more than truth. Or, for instance, you've seen what also, one of the biggest revelations of WikiLeaks was, what's the name, collateral murder, about the US killing also Reuters journalists and civilians. Was there a resistance movement behind that? It's a big question, but what gives me a bit hope is that the movement supporting whistleblowers is really rising today. I think that more and more people are actually becoming aware of this topic. For instance, in Serbia, 5 years ago, you couldn't speak about Assange, Snowden, or Chelsea Manning, except, you know, some mainstream articles and so on. But it's becoming a topic which is... I'll stop here because I could also become very melancholic.
No, I mean, maybe to answer the question, maybe we need a different source of technology to organize information. Currently, the platforms that are available online and the social media somehow do not help the democratic project. Maybe there needs to be a Web 3.0 that is generated by different coding, and that actually will enable us to share authentic information and to actually realize some of these dreams and hopes that we all had in the 90s when digital communication came about, and we all thought, now we can communicate and now we can exchange and now we can connect in a better way. This has not yet reached fruition yet. So maybe we need a combination of new technologies that are not controlled by companies that just want to steal our data. Maybe we need models of data exchange which will enable us to keep our own data. So let's hope that there will be developments in this field maybe in the future.
More questions? Maybe on the left side, if you have there is a question up. Great.
Thank you. Well, you know, about the media that we use to connect with each other, they are all full of different kinds of advertisement and all kinds of information, right and false. Is it anyhow possible to take ourselves off the grid, not in a hippie-like way, but, for example, if I just rely on what I see near me, if I rely on the close to me society, if I stop using television, if I stop using these media for some time and just rely on my first-hand experience or second-hand experience, not go that far, would it help anyhow? Would it kind of just help me get rid of some concepts which keep me actually imprisoned? For example, if you look at the front pages of newspaper, which are most sold here, you would see terrible stuff. But for example, you've mentioned, am I too quick or am I consuming too much time?
No, you're not, but try slowly to come to the question mark.
Okay.
I mean, I got it already, whether living off the grid and so on, but...
taking ourselves off the grid.
Yeah.
The grid, which, as we see in media, implies some values, like nation. For example, national traitors you mentioned. These people were labeled as national traitors. So nation, somebody close to me by blood. My brother, and then my family, and then my nation. They are somebody who is supposed to keep me warm and keep me safe. And as long as I have my nation with me, whatever they act, they might be evil or not, I am safe. So I'm not ready to give up on nation, on that safety for good, for my ideals, for what I believe is good. And the same goes with private property, for example. So that's something I also wanted to address, but sorry, I won't just talk about that. But I think it's impossible to rebel in a right way if we don't drop these values, as long as we feel safe with them. But safety is not within them, I believe. So how are we going to get the right, so-called right, values between ourselves if the main media, the ways we connect, are just imposing the wrong ones?
Okay, thank you very much. Norman?
I think we need a smartphone-free day globally. Every Monday, no one's going to use the internet for one day, and that will be very liberating, give us liberating energy, the whole mankind. That's just a suggestion. Maybe we'll all follow it, and it will. Or Fridays, no more smartphones on Fridays. But then they can't connect for the protest. Well, I'll think some more. But it's something we really need to think about. Now I really need a PAVI team to come up with an answer how to create a revolutionary movement. But I think we do need it, and we need it across the board. We need it across Europe. I think we need a pan-European movement. This became very clear to me when I was in Athens, actually, the last time. Hopefully there will be more movements like you are active in DM25, which I think is a very good approach. It's a movement that is active in several countries in Europe at the same time. So I think movements like this might grow and help us regain our freedom.
Thank you, Norman. More questions? More. So while you are waiting for the... Yes? Great. And the mic is coming as well.
When I came here, I expected something more, something different, let's say.
What, Stervitin or?
No, for you, both. But that was my mistake, expecting something different. Anyhow, not too much about drugs. Anyhow, you raised two questions for me. What I was thinking, okay, finally I realized you are here because Bitef has to do something with organization, self-organization, or Selbstverteidigung, or something like that. Anyhow, I got 2 points. First, you, Mr. Horvat, you said something about principle, like a joke, that truck going to somewhere to Europe, and it was somewhere where is the picture of that principle. We are not talking here serious, I'm not talking, it's too much serious about political things here, but I don't like somebody telling about Gardner principle, just pauschal, something like this envelope of the drug, more or less, yeah? But Gardner principle is unknown now here. Even the nationalists are not using it. But, to make a joke, something has sense. That the drug is going to Europe, maybe to Serbia, and I see now the connection to your book, to the drugs. Maybe we need 7 million drugs here, pills, for the people here. Yeah, making a joke. And also, my question is, what you started now talking about, but you were very last to ask something. We are on the end of your time here. What about organization in Serbia and those people? That's one movement, just for our test. Mr. Olerom, that's Selbstverteidigung. So that means self, that's English, Selbstverteidigung
Self-defense.
Yeah, self-defense. Yeah, there is one small group of elderly people, yeah, trying to go another way, to give us the example what to do. Yeah. Not a single young person is inside. Well, let's see what will happen. But something must be done in Serbia. In that way, you are on the border. Yeah, you are just you. Instead of just touching that with DM and do. Yeah. DM has no chance in Serbia for the moment. Yeah. We need something which is completely different. There are traces, there are things in Europe moving in that direction. Yeah. But we are not capable here to modulate, to articulate anything because of the regime. Clear. Yeah. But something has to be done here as well. That's why I'm talking here about broad audience here, about that we have to do something. Otherwise, like liberals, yeah, nice example, who was in that movement and doing something here in that difficult time. Otherwise, you will go to the film Brazil. I hope I can already see the future when we are going against the system, like Robert De Niro. No, that was not Robert De Niro. Other guy, not Robert De Niro. In Brazil, yeah, who is fighting against the regime. We have to do now something, otherwise we will end like Robert De Niro.
Okay, thanks a lot. Can I try to answer because it was directly to me? So perhaps you know, but in 2007, which is, my God, I'm getting old. 12 years ago, Ivan Čolović published a book by myself, and I usually don't speak so much about myself, but it was called Against Political Correctness. 12 years ago, and I still stick to the main point of that book, which gives me the license in the same way, you know, James Bond has a license to kill. I think I have a license to make jokes about Gavrilo Princip, especially because I think that he was a positive figure, although the effects were disastrous, but I would say that the effects of Gavrilo Princip's assassination of Franz Ferdinand were not the effects of his own triggering, you know, the pistol, but it were effects of, well, a war between imperialist powers which was already taking place. I made the joke because I find it really, really interesting. Why do drug dealers from Serbia put Gavrilo Princip on the drugs? Then I learned that all the drugs actually have a label, but it might also have to do something with the historical revisionist narrative in Serbia, where Gavrilo Princip is being turned into a Serbian national hero instead of being an anti-imperialist hero, you know. So I'm glad you mentioned it, but Gavrilo Princip also had some lessons for our days today, which was you have to connect instead of going back to the nation state, as you said. You have to go beyond the nation state and connect, which is, I think, also a big lesson of the group of Haro and Libertas. The second question, I don't know whether DiEM25 has a chance in Serbia or not. This is not my responsibility, it is yours responsibility. Read the program, see whether you think it fits into Serbia. I think that the Green New Deal is definitely something which Serbia needs as well. Unfortunately, in the same way as in Croatia, we are centuries away from something as a Green New Deal. We are actually importing diesel cars from Germany who are having an energy event, they're going into Green New Deal and so on. Well, Belgrade during winter months is suffocating in bad air in the same manner as some Chinese cities are suffocating. So don't tell me, I know very well about the problems in Serbia, you know probably much better, but I share your opinion that you need something here. And it's not that you need something here, but we need something here. Because I think we also have to go surpass this boundary between us and you. And I'm not talking just about Croatians and Serbs. I'm also talking about the Germans and all other nationalities. What is to be done? Well, as you know, that's a question. It was posed so many times, and also by Lenin and before him. Don't wait for the Messiah. Don't be cynical. I'm disappointed that you're not happy about the event or you expected more, but I think what we should do, and it's also a responsibility of us, especially of the younger ones, I would say, is to open these kind of topics, to say why this matters for today's moment. Why is this what happened in Nazi Germany? How is it connected to something what we might call narco-capitalism? What are the Serbian elites doing with the narco business, for instance? You know, that's also a big topic. So I think it opens ways, and even if one person goes out of this room by starting to explore something from this book, I think it could show ways of future resistance. For instance, this book, well, I'm not saying that we need, as you said, so many drugs, but I posed myself a question, you know, what about the partisans? What about the Yugoslav anti-fascist movement? You know, did they take any drugs? Now you can say it's not a relevant question, but I think it's an interesting question. And then finally I found in a book by Louis Houteau, the guy who wrote a book called Guns for Tito, that was an American spy, call it like that, who was in Bari, and he organized the transfer of arms from Bari to Vis in late 1943, and I've sent you the quote after you visited Vis, where they mentioned Benzendrin. You know, the partisans come in the morning on the boat and they drink rakia, and then comes this American and says, please have a taste of this, and he says the partisans never ask, they just do whatever, you know, just drink and blah, 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 and it's Benzendrin to keep them awake. Well, I think what we tried to do today, this topic, as you know, in Yugoslavia is not researched at all, and I hope someone will research it. What we did today, I hope, is to de-tabuize, you know, drugs is a taboo. Probably half of this room probably took some sort of drugs, but it's still a taboo to talk publicly about drugs. And I think we should be talking about drugs, not the pharmaceutical companies selling us drugs. So in that sense, I think, you know, the role of philosophical theater is not just to be another program of Bitef Festival, it is to add something to the festival, which is more than the festival itself, which is, I hope, a critical reflection and also a big question of all of us, what is to be done. So I hope I answered. There is another question, and I think we should be... Excuse me, take the mic because the translators have to hear you.
Thank you very much. I actually got much more than I expected to get from this, and especially blew my mind that the Nazis were on drugs. I never knew. Who knew? My question is about that particular book is, how far do you go with it? How far in the Second World War do you go with it? Because the problem with methamphetamines is, if it was all good and you're just happy, we would all be on it all the time. There's withdrawal symptoms. Did they lose the Leningrad because...
Well, the first negative effects were already shown in France, and Ranke traveled to France to examine the first negative side effects. Older officers died from heart failure because they took too much methamphetamine. There was then a big discussion within the German army, should we continue to use it in the attack on the Soviet Union? It was used, hundreds of millions of pills were used. I was able to speak to a medical officer who still dished out methamphetamine in Stalingrad. I met him when he was obviously very old, but he remembered it very clearly, how he gave methamphetamine to half-starved German soldiers just to keep them fighting for one more day. But he said everyone already knew that Pervitin is not helping in the long war that was World War II, which was never intended, obviously, by the Nazis, that their only chance of winning was to only have the Blitzkrieg. They wanted to have a European-wide Blitzkrieg, which then failed with the Soviet Union and the strong resistance of the Soviet Union. Ranke, also the professor who started the Pervitin program, he also realized that the Pervitin craze, in a way, is ending, is not helping the German war effort anymore, and the consequences that he drew, kind of similar, which may be a good way to end this discussion or to come to a close, is he had similar conclusions, and the architect of this church, Ranke, then applied for a post as a professor in Zagreb to get out of the German war machine. And yeah, this...
Unluckily in Zagreb. There was the shower already in power, right?
Yeah, and he actually didn't get the job because he wasn't a Nazi enough for the Zagreb University. That's why he didn't get the job, because he wasn't in the party.
As Thomas Bernhard said once, I think, he said today there are more Nazis in Vienna than in 33. Maybe he wouldn't get a job on the university today, who knows. But I'll stop with my jokes. It was a great ending, I think, by Norman. If there is one last question, quick one, just shout. Okay, if you're not shout. Okay, we will take one last question, although the ending I think was beautiful, but...
Thank you for the opportunity. So going back to the motto of WikiLeaks, truth will set you free. I just wanted to say that maybe what WikiLeaks is providing is not the capital T truth, but more like a set of facts, and it's usually hard to construct a cohesive truth based on facts. So maybe the lesson of like maybe last decade with the triumph of fake news or like alternative facts, as one Trump supporter calls them, maybe there's a need for alternative facts, like new kind of narratives to combat what we have today, with like kind of psychological intensity and strength.
Thanks. I think this is also a great closing, because I think what Norman Oler's work is showing is precisely alternative facts, you know, which are not, which are facts, but which are facts which are shedding a new light on historical events and political events which we took for granted. So again, thanks a lot. Thanks to the Bitef Festival. Thank you for all your questions. See you soon.
Thank you very much.